for neurodivergent children, calm doesn't come from thinking about calm. It comes from what the ears are telling the nervous system. And when the ears are saying, hey, this is predictable, this is safe, this is steady, we're all good, the nervous system immediately responds. No thinking, no effort, no performance, just sound doing what I love about it, which is sound doing what it does best.
Hello and welcome to this month's Circle of Experts conversation. I'm Nicola Maria Rose, the founder of HushAway and The PeacePath. And this month we're going deeper into the science behind the sound. Joining me is Mark Tew, psychoacoustics analyst, sound frequency expert, and someone who brings a really unique perspective to this work, not just professionally, but personally, as someone who lives with ADHD. Mark, thank you so much for being here.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
This month's theme is the science of sound, and I wanted to start right at the heart of it, psychoacoustics. Sounds amazing, but most people who hear that word, they think it sounds maybe a little bit complicated, but actually what it means is incredibly relevant to every parent and teacher listening. So let's get into it. Mark, what happens in a child's brain when they hear a solfeggio frequency? So can you walk us through what actually happens neurologically when a child hears, let's say, something like 528 hertz? Are we talking electrical changes? Are we talking chemical shifts, or both?
Love it. That's a great question and a brilliant place to start. I love this one because this is where science becomes like tangible. So let's sort of simplify and trace the journey. When a child hears a solfeggio frequency, let's, like you say, use 528 hertz as an example. The sound wave enters the ear canal, hits the eardrum, and travels through the cochlea. The cochlea converts that mechanical vibration in the air into electrical signals. And those signals don't just go straight to the auditory cortex, which is where sort of conscious hearing happens. They also travel directly to the brainstem, and the brainstem feeds straight into the autonomic nervous system. Now, that's the part of the brain that regulates the involuntary actions of our body, like heartbeat, breathing, pupil dilation, those sorts of actions that we don't consciously think to do. And that's the critical pathway. So ear, cochlea, brainstem, and then autonomic nervous system. The entire chain happens in microseconds, in milliseconds. It's in incomprehensibly small amount of time. So before the child has any conscious thought about what they're hearing, their nervous system has already started to respond to it. So to answer the question sort of directly, it's both electrical and chemical. The electrical piece is the kind of brainwave shift. EEG studies, including work by Yang and colleagues that has replicated and updated through to 2025, show that exposure to frequencies such as 432 hertz and related Solfeggio frequencies increase alpha and theta brainwave activity within 3 to 5 minutes. Alpha waves are associated with relaxed wakefulness, and theta waves are associated with deep calm, the kind of pre-sleep state. So the brain's electrical activity is literally shifting towards regulation. The chemical piece, again, we're talking fractions of a millisecond. The chemical piece follows very quickly after. A meta-analysis published in Applied Sciences across 14 peer-reviewed studies found that children aged sort of 6 to 12 show measurable reductions in cortisol and increases in heart rate variability within 8 to 12 minutes of exposure to frequency-based sound. And this is the bit that really matters. Regardless of whether the child was consciously paying attention to the content, the nervous system responded anyway, which is huge. The distinction is everything for neurodivergent children, because traditional approaches to calm, guided meditation, breathing exercises, even counting techniques, all require a cognitive engagement. They ask the child to think their way to being calm. But if a child's nervous system is already triggered and in fight or flight mode, the sort of prefrontal cortex, the thinking part of your brain, is essentially offline. It's out for a minute. Please leave a message after the tone. We're asking them to use is the very part of the brain that stress has switched off. So sound can influence the nervous system before conscious processing fully engaged. So It doesn't need the child's permission. It doesn't require any focus. It doesn't need them to understand what's happening. The frequency enters through the ear, reaches the brainstem and the autonomic nervous system, and it starts to shift. This can support increased parasympathetic activity. That's a mouthful, isn't it? Often reflected to improved vagal tone. So what happens is cortisol starts to drop, the heart rate begins to settle and regulate, and only then, once the nervous system has moved out of threat mode, does the child become available for connection, conversation, learning. So it puts them into the calm state. There's a recent review in the 2025 Journal of American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, and for the rest of this, I'm calling it JCAP. It puts it quite clearly. Specific sound frequencies directly influence the parasympathetic autonomic nervous system, independent of conscious activity or cognitive engagement, independent of it. I mean, that's not a small thing. That is a fundamental shift in how we're thinking about supporting children who can't think their way calm. I mean, it's revolutionary. And that's why solfeggio frequencies aren't just calming music. They're literally a neurological intervention that meets the child's nervous system where it actually is, not where we wish it was, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And you've explained that in such a really easy way for parents and educators to understand. It's so fascinating. And a lot of parents do actually tell us that their neurodivergent child can't do the guided meditations, that they switch off, they get frustrated, or they have a meltdown. But when we at HushAway, when we use frequency-based sound loops, something does shift. Why is that?
I mean, this is something I feel quite personally attached to, because as someone who has ADHD, I know exactly what it's like when someone asks you to close your eyes and imagine a peaceful beach. Great. My brain doesn't go to the beach. It goes to 17 beaches at once, all at the speed of light, and each one of them has different sand. And I'm thinking, I wonder what rock got ground down to these beaches. And it's not a guided meditation. It's a glided step into chaos. And that's often a challenge for guided meditations for neurodivergent children because they demand a cognitive load. You have to listen to the words. You have to process the language. You have to hold an image in your working memory. You have to follow a sequence. And for a child whose brain is already working overtime just to manage the sensory environment around them, that's not calming. It's another thing to do. Research published in JCAP in 2025 shows that many children with ADHD experience heightened sensory sensitivity, particularly in the auditory processing. So when we're asking a child to listen to guided meditation, we're literally overloading the exact channel that's already overwhelmed. We're adding demand to a system that has the least capacity to absorb it. So if we contrast that with a simple repetitive sound loop, no words to decode, no narrative to follow, no decisions to make about what image or having to count how many seconds to breathe in and out, just a consistent mathematical pattern frequency entering the ear, processing through the auditory pathways, including the brainstem, straight in. The cognitive load is significantly lower, and that's where it gets like proper spicy for us. The reason repetition feels regulating rather than boring to a neurodivergent child is multifaceted. And part of it relates to something called thalamic gating. The thalamus acts as like a sensory filter. It helps us decide what reaches conscious attention and what stays in the background. When auditory input becomes repetitive and predictable, it tends to require less attention and becomes less salient to the brain. That reduces the overall processing load and makes it less likely that the system will flag it as an input and give it a little tag that it needs urgent attention. It stops it being that for the child. So for an anxious child, that can be quite protective because their brain's often scanning for novelty and potential threat, like sudden sounds, changes in tone, unpredictable patterns. In 2026, a study in Frontiers of Psychiatry found that between sort of 50 to 70% of autistic people report hypersensitivity to just general everyday sounds. And 40%-ish meet the criteria of hyperacusis compared to sort of 8 or 9% of the general population. So just everyday sound environments that neurotypical people would consider normal can generally increase stress. The predictable frequency patterns are the opposite of threatening. They're carefully structured, harmonically consistent, and they repeat. The brain recognizes the pattern and almost immediately stops treating it as something to be analyzed. And once the threat detection system quietens, the parasympathetic nervous system can do its job. There's a meta review across sort of 30 studies and over 5,000 participants confirmed this in 2025 that neurodivergent children show heightened sensory responses to all types of auditory input, but they respond significantly more positively to structured, repetitive patterns rather than sort of complex, layered, or unpredictable audio content. In a way, the pattern becomes part of the regulation. And I think the simplest way I can put this is for neurodivergent children, calm doesn't come from thinking about calm. It comes from what the ears are telling the nervous system. And when the ears are saying, hey, this is predictable, this is safe, this is steady, we're all good, the nervous system immediately responds. No thinking, no effort, no performance, just sound doing what I love about it, which is sound doing what it does best.
Thanks, Mark. And we know that not all background sounds do regulate the nervous system equally. And so let's just look at kind of solfeggio frequencies and the work that it does differently. So we know that neurodivergent children experience sound differently. So let's talk about the neuroscience, about what makes frequency-based sound then more beneficial for neurodivergent children.
So yeah, this is really important because so many parents are already using like white and brown noise. Already that's a very familiar thing. There's a million and one apps that offer it, and that's not wrong. But there's a fundamental difference between masking a sound and regulating a sound. And I think once you understand that, it changes how you think about what you're playing for the child. So let's start with acoustics. So white noise contains all audible frequencies distributed evenly across the spectrum, which is why it's essentially every frequency at once. Brown noise is very similar, but weighted towards the lower end of the spectrum. So it's deeper, warmer, more like a rumble. And pink noise hits somewhere in between with more balance across low and high frequencies. They are broadband sound, meaning they're spread across a wide range of frequencies without a simple repeating pattern that the brain can sort of lock onto easily. And that's exactly why they work for some things. Exactly what you need in the right circumstance. But if your child is sensitive to unpredictable environmental sounds, a door closing, dog barking, a sibling shouting, bad noise can sort of mask the interruption, but it's only creating an acoustic barrier, a sort of sound shield, if you like. The unpredictable sounds are still there, but the brain finds it more difficult to distinguish those sounds. So the startle response reduces. That's helpful, and it has a valid use, but masking is not regulating. And I often see that people get confused between the two because they see a process that's working, but masking is not regulating. What Solfeggio frequencies are often described as narrowband, meaning they are focusing on a more specific range of frequencies rather than spreading energy across the entire spectrum. For example, tones like 528, 432, and 396 are single frequencies or near single frequency sounds. They are the single frequency base for a soundscape. That tends to matter from a neuroscience perspective because it's the difference between structured and unstructured audio input. Research suggests that the brain responds differently to predictable, consistent sound patterns compared to more diffused broadband noises. Repetitive sound can be easier for the brain to process and may support more stable attention or relaxation, whereas broadband noise provides a constant but less defined signal. So rather than the effect coming from a specific frequency itself, it's the presence of a clear, consistent pattern that gives the brain something simple to follow, which can reduce processing demand compared to a more complex, unstructured sound. And this is where we now tie it into the nervous system. Porg's work on the vagus nerve highlights how the brain responds to cues of safety and threat in the environment around them, including sound. So predictable, non-threatening auditory input can help signal safety to the nervous system, which in turn supports a shift towards parasympathetic regulation. That shift is associated with measurable physiological change, such as improvements in heart rate variability, more stable breathing patterns. So rather than the effect coming from a specific frequency itself, it's the quality of the sound and its predictability and how it's perceived by the nervous system that matters most. So when a parent says, brown noise helps my child fall asleep, I'd say, yep, cool. Keep using it if it works. But understand what it's doing and why it's doing it. It's reducing acoustic interruption. It's creating a barrier, like I said, a sound shield that's a passive intervention. Frequency-based sound is active. It's not a passive intervention. It's not blocking out the world. It's sending a specific signal to the nervous system that says, here's a pattern you can synchronize with. Here's something steady. Here's something safe. And the nervous system responds by shifting towards regulation, not because the distractions are gone, but because it can support a shift towards the parasympathetic regulation, which is associated with vagal activity. There's a practical finding that backs up this beautifully. 2025 Applied Sciences Review found that children using frequency-based sound showed significantly greater compliance and sustained use than those using brown and white noise. Retention rates of sort of 60, 70% versus 40% after 4 weeks. Children stayed with it. And the likely reason, I believe, is that the nervous system match is better. Broadband noise gets tuned out eventually because the brain habituates to it. Frequency-based sound continues to entrain the brain. It's structured and the nervous system keeps responding to it. So for simplicity, brown noise helps some children because it's predictable, but frequency-based sound goes a step further. It's predictable and it's tuned to how the nervous system naturally responds. One blocks the noise and the other speaks directly to the nervous system.
And so let's talk about this a bit deeper then. We talk about acoustic design for neurodivergent children and how to kind of audit and optimize the soundscape that they listen to. Can we talk a lot about what children hear through HushAway? So, and just to add onto what you've said, we don't use brown noise and we don't use white noise for those very reasons, because of the huge benefits behind a frequency-based sound. But what about the broader sound environment that children are in, like the bedrooms and the kitchens and the classrooms? How do we help a parent think about that as part of the noise library that a children's listening to?
This is a very practical question, and I think it's quite often gets overlooked because we tend to focus on what we're adding to the pot, what playlist, what app, what tool, without taking a step back and asking what's already happening in the environment, what's already there that we have control over. So I'll walk through what I call a soundscape audit, if you like. It doesn't require any special attention, literally just need to step back and be aware. So there are 4 things to pay attention to. We've got background noise levels. How loud is the baseline environment? Frequency composition. Is it mostly low hums or are there high-pitched content like alarms, notifications, kitchen appliances? Predictability. Can your child anticipate that they're going to hear the next sound, or is the environment full of sudden changes? And change patterns. How often does the soundscape shift? And also how abruptly? Most parents probably not thought as deeply about sound in those terms, but that's understandable because we live in a soundscape. It's not something that most people find unique because we're all in there. But when you do step back, patterns very quickly emerge. Let's take a kitchen at breakfast time, for example. There's the kettle, the radio, siblings talking, cutlery, a phone buzzing on the counter. There's high noise, high frequency, low predictability. It's a manic environment. For a neurotypical child, that is busy, but manageable. For a neurodivergent child whose auditory system is already working overtime, it can tip them into dysregulation. And that's before school's even started. Research from Kim and colleagues published in Applied Sciences in 2025 found children aged 6 to 12 are most vulnerable to auditory environment impact. And those in higher noise environments above sort of 65, 75 decibels, which is a heated conversation or the ambient level in a busy restaurant, show significantly elevated cortisol, even when they're also using regulated sound devices. So the baseline environment matters. It's not just about what you play for the child. It's about what's already going on before you add that to the cooking pot, if you like. Now, without knee-jerking, because the answer is not silence, removing sound entirely isn't possible in a family home. And it's not really helpful either, because children need sound. It's how they orient. It's how they learn. It's how they connect. So we're not looking to get rid of it. The goal here is to shape the ratio. More predictable sounds, fewer charring transitions, less competing input at the moments that matter most. So a simple framework for the morning could be to reduce competing audio sources. If the radio's on or the TV's on, turn them off. If someone's on the phone, like that's free, completely unrelated soundscapes that are colliding. Pick one or none. Like turn the radio off, turn the telly off. If there's a phone, if the radio's on and the phone goes off, leave the room. But we're not expecting people to create this perfect sound bubble, but there are things that we can do to reduce competing audio sources. At homework time, for example, this is a constant problem where soundscapes make a big difference. A frequency-based sound playing through headphones creates what I describe as like a nervous system boundary. It doesn't block the world out entirely, but it gives the auditory system something predictable to anchor to, so the brain isn't consistently scanning and filtering everything else that's going on in the room. Bedtime, reduce high frequency sounds like an hour before sleep. Screens, notifications, even some electronics like, I won't name, budget power supplies that charge like LED lighting. They can produce a really faint hum. I have a power supply on my desk that if I have all three things turned on, starts to go brrr. But these things have an effect. The conscious mind doesn't necessarily notice it, but the nervous system does. The auditory system sensitivity isn't arbitrary, it's developmental. The human auditory system begins developing in utero from approximately 18 weeks of gestation. I remember we used to read stories to my wife's bump when she was pregnant. We were aware that sounds are important even at that very early stage. And in early childhood, it plays an important role in how the brain learns, how it processes and responds to sound. The patterns established during those years shape the child's autonomic baseline. So the sound environment we create for young children isn't just about comfort in the moment. It's shaping how their nervous system learns to respond to sound in years to come. In the classroom, this is even more pronounced. So a 2025 educational research showed that high classroom noise levels can reduce cognitive performance, particularly in neurodivergent children. But this has also been noticed in neurotypical children as well. But there's an encouraging finding. Frequency-based intervention during transition points, so like the 5 minutes between lessons or coming back from break or settling after lunch, improved post-transition focus. So not by making the classroom quieter. Again, there are certain things we can't control, but giving the nervous system something structured to recalibrate with for 5 minutes before the lesson, it bridges directly to how HushAway fits into all of this beautifully. The platform works best when the baseline environment is calmer, absolutely. But the beauty of it is that even in a noisy home or a busy school, putting headphones on a child and playing a frequency-based soundscape creates that nervous system boundary I mentioned, and it gives the auditory system a single predictable structured signal to focus on. The chaos doesn't disappear. We're not magicians, but the nervous system stops trying to process it all at once. It anchors to the frequency, and from that anchor, regulation becomes possible. So my advice to sort of any parents listening to this would be, before you add anything new, spend a day just noticing what your children are already hearing. Even make a note. And when you're doing the breakfast, take a step back and just write down the sounds that you can hear. Walk through your home at certain times of the day that you find the hardest, like morning, after school, bedtime, and have a really good listen, like really listen. You'll start to hear what their nervous system is dealing with. And from there, you can make those small changes to the ratio of predictable versus unpredictable sounds, and that could shift everything.
Mm. It's fascinating, Mark. And it gets amplified. 2 weeks ago, I went for a walk and I was walking along the river, and I thought, I'm just going to take a note of all the different sounds I hear from, I mean, the obvious things like traffic, water, bubbling in the river, the birds. But then there was the sound of the wheels of a bicycle going past me, then a runner and the heavy breathing and people walking, chatting on their phone. And then the airplane was going over. And I thought, wow, this is only a 20-minute walk. And I must have heard about 30 different sounds. It's incredible. And you're right. Then you layer or look at that through a neurodivergent lens and what poor children are trying to, what they're challenged with and trying to navigate. It makes it even more difficult. Mental health. So, Mark, we've got Mental Health Awareness Week in May, and we know that mental health isn't just emotional. And the theme for MHAW this year is action. And we know that sound is actually an action that the nervous system can take. It's particularly everything that you've just talked about. So, with Mental Health Awareness Week, nervous system action, trauma-informed sound, and vagal tone mental health, this is a really nice topic for us to explore. So how would you frame sound frequencies as an action and not just a coping tool, but an actual physiological intervention?
It's an amazing reframe. I love it. I'm glad you've asked it that way, because when most people hear mental health action, they think about taking therapies or journaling or breathing exercises. And those are all valuable. But what we often miss is that the nervous system doesn't wait for you to think your way into calm. It responds to input, and sound is an input. When sound enters the auditory system, it can influence the autonomic nervous system, including pathways like vagal regulation, which is essentially the body's kind of regulatory highway. The vagus nerve governs the shift between your threat response and your social engagement system. Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory suggests that the vagal pathways associated with safety are engaged. When they're engaged, the body can shift from a defensive state towards a more regulated, socially engaged state. That shift is associated with measurable physiological changes, and this is where it gets exciting for children. Research from Kemp and colleagues, meta-analysis that's been updated as recently as 2025, shows that heart rate variability, which is a direct marker of the vagal tone, is a protective factor against anxiety, depression, and even ADHD symptom severity. So higher vagal tone means a more resilient nervous system. And there is strong evidence that heart rate variability is associated with emotional regulation and resilience. So when we talk about action for Mental Health Awareness Week, this is what I'd want people to understand. Playing a carefully designed soundscape for a child is not passive. It's not background noise. It's an active physiological intervention. This can support a shift towards the parasympathetic regulation. These types of changes are often reflected in measures like I mentioned, heart, HRV, breathing patterns, and stress hormone levels. These are all measurable outcomes. And what matters even more, particularly for neurodivergent children or children with high stress exposure, is that this becomes preventative. So research presented in the JCAP and adolescent psychiatry suggests that children with higher baseline stress often show greatest benefits from regulation-focused interventions. The children who need it most respond the most. Now, that's not coping, that's not distraction, that's supporting the development of more stable regulation patterns in the nervous system on how to find its way back to a steady before emotional dysregulation becomes a mental health crisis. Yeah. If I had to leave you with a thought on this topic, I would say sound frequencies are not a distraction from emotional work.
Stop. I'm going to lead into that. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, it doesn't make sense. Let me lead into it and then you can do that a little bit. God, Mark, it's absolutely fascinating. Honestly, thank you for sharing the most amazing insights with us today. If you had to leave one thought with us, what would it be?
If I had to leave you with one thought, it would be that sound frequencies are not a distraction from emotional work. They are a foundation that makes emotional regulation possible. And pressing play on something that supports your child's vagal tone, that's an action, like a real action.
Mark, thank you. What I absolutely love about this conversation is that It takes something that can feel really quite academic, and you speak with such expertise. Psychoacoustics, frequency, vibration, all of those terms that maybe we don't really understand, and it makes it all real. But also makes it practical, because ultimately this is about children. It's about a child who can't settle after school. This is the day-to-day. A child who's overwhelmed in a busy classroom, a child whose nervous system just needs something steady to come back to. And sound can be that bridge. And that's where I guess HushAway is fundamentally different to other apps. It doesn't target calm as a destination. It actually starts with the cause. It targets it at the very beginning through psychoacoustic design, Solfeggio frequencies. HushAway works at that nervous system level, so before conscious thought. And there's nothing else quite like it on the market. And I know I'm a bit biased, but there's nothing there that does this for children aged 4 to 10 years old, especially neurodivergent children. So to everyone who's listening, if you'd like to explore what this sounds like in practice, please find us at HushAway.com. Thank you for listening. And Mark, genuinely, thank you for sharing your expertise with us.
Thank you for having me.